my talk at Bond University, Claire invited me around to see her at the Foundry here, to see what the setup was. And I was just delighted to see a building. I've been in Brisbane a long time, 71 years, and this is one that I hadn't sniffed out, and it was just delightful to find something of such quality that I hadn't been aware of before. A couple of years ago, I had a similar experience when I met my walking group up at a place called the Gantry near Mount Mee, and I hadn't seen that before either. And it's just a wonderful, tough old industrial building like this one. In fact, it was inhabited by this kookaburra. It looked like he just tightened the nut when he landed, these old functional industrial buildings have some admirable forebears. The first one I can remember photographing dates from my student days. I didn't even have a camera. I must have borrowed Mum's, and I went down to Wynnum with Russell Hall and Paul Smith, mates of mine from the course, to visit the old brickworks at Wynnum, near where Paul lived. It looks like we just got there in time. You can forget about a 5-mile radius. This operates on a 5-chain radius, and for my young audience, a chain is a cricket pitch long, and it's consumed all the clay within 5 cricket pitches of the building, and the building's in imminent state of collapse. I guess it didn't last long after our visit, but I love that footing just hanging out there. It had a very, very tenuous grip on existence when we arrived. In my last year of student life, I found myself in a tight London environment, and I received a couple of boxes of slides from Russell containing seductive images like that, and I could hear the sirens singing. I just had to come home. But it's no wonder that I hadn't found this place. It's a wonderfully successful exercise in garden and topographical concealment, I think. That's a photograph from the next ridge. There's some food and drink available, so as we go through this talk, you'll see where you are. I'll start an area called vernacular, and if you see a boring one and you want to duck out for some dal or a wine, you'll be well placed. The Bond University asked me to discuss regional architecture, local knowledge, some almost lost, and issues concerning vernacular and its relationship to culture and climate. Well, I tried to do that, although I must say now that the word regional at first brands you and then almost sinks you with its unfashionable weight. Now that I'm at the end of my architectural practicing career, I'll drift over the scope of work I undertook in a number of regions, and you can judge how significant a part these issues played. Firstly, there's a short talking bit without pictures. I'll give you my take on vernacular. In language, when a word is said to have entered the vernacular, it's first been in frequent use and then been so useful as a pungent expression, and after that it's been absorbed. So the absorption occurred because the word felt right on the tongue. In today's argot, it's gone viral. For example, a dim bulb is an expression I've heard in recent years for someone considered to have limited intelligence. Drongo is an older expression meaning a similar thing, but dying out in use. The former is more international in its roots, the latter more local, and I guess it feels a little too agricultural to be comfortably used now. Vernacular moves on in language. It's not stationary. It has a cutting edge advancing it. Vernacular in the world of buildings is usually a title attributed to some old and primitive ones. It's considered a dead topic. However, I feel the concept of vernacular in buildings should be taken forward as it is in language. I think it is an end that design skills should be put to produce architecture. Design skills are initially taught in schools of architecture in a studio environment, and I've always felt the studio environment generates a sort of show-off culture. Nothing evil, but that's just the nature of the game. I think that the learning of design skills has also to take place as a kind of immersion process in practice. In building terms, vernacular, as I see it, refers to a way of doing things that capitalises on the accumulated knowledge of what has preceded, put together with current technology and materials, and practice to move it forward. So that's the end of that spiel. On a trip to Singapore and Malaysia a few years ago, the buildings that caught my eye and remain with me were the ordinary buildings of empire. These buildings were the work of young men who, for the most part, were trained in their profession in the UK and sent out to remote parts to produce these works. Market halls, mess halls, barracks, houses. You don't often see photographs of buildings in the rain. Whatever was required. They quickly added local climate and building context to their knowledge and formal training, and after no doubt some early mistakes, they learnt on the job, the immersion process in practice. One of these empire architects, growing up in China, training in Edinburgh, and coming back to the east to work in the 1930s, fled the imminent Japanese invasion and ended up in Darwin. Betty Burnett's roots can easily be seen in these rich works built up there. You can see the sort of building vernacular I was born into by checking out the background in this baby shot of me from Toowong in 1947. It might be 1947, but it was my grandmother's house, and the streets in the neighbourhood had names like Sudan and Rouen, so it's a post-World War I estate, and those are the buildings you can see in the background behind Mum and Dad. In the early 70s, I was asked by a friend who was starting a restaurant in the area to fit out the shop he was renting and to make an identifying image for the front window. This is a shot I took of Red Hill at the time. There's considerably more vegetation around now. Using Robin Dodd's dominant church, St Bridget's, as a backdrop, I thought long and hard about abstracting the cottages that surround it coming up the hill. The influence of that thinking was still on my mind. No, that's the shop window that eventually took place. Unfortunately, I haven't got it on the glass. But it was still on my mind when I did our first house in '74. So it obviously had an influence. These are in the days when you could build roofs without too much protection. That's how it looked, pretty raw in 1974. I've always been fond of the engineering tradition of the exploded view. It's an extremely useful way of explaining the component parts of a working machine. Well, I'm not saying that the house is a machine for living in, but it does have component parts that fit together. So I thought I'd make an exploded view of my own. The relationship of these component parts I've taken selectively from trade practice are repeated again and again in my following domestic scale work, so I thought it would be worth a closer look now. I was told early in my architectural training that good buildings speak to the four elements: earth, air, fire and water. Well, this is as fluent as I can be about how water runs off a building. In that same year, 1974, I was working at Goodsabaker Wild and I designed some student halls of residence at the University of Technology in Lae in Papua New Guinea. I devised 2-storey blocks zigzagging around the site with 8 rooms upstairs and 12 down under huge roofs. The space circulated freely between the rooms and the roof. You might be able to see there. And it was in the fashion of these old fettlers' huts that were still around at the time. They were the people who did the maintenance on the railway lines. But there were huts like these throughout Australia. I've seen them all over at Mount Isa in early shots there for the miners. Just something to separate the hot roof from the weather roof and put it in the shade. Lae had a huge rainfall, just under 5 metres annually, and usually as a straight downpour. So we gave it a go, and it was reasonably successful. Working in Lae in Papua New Guinea with a climate like that was a little like working in the acceleration chamber of the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station. I guess that doesn't exist anymore, but it was where they used to test building materials down in Melbourne, I believe. If things were going to fail, they'd fail quickly, and you found out in a hurry. So you made all your mistakes and had to fix them up. The culture of indigenous buildings in Papua New Guinea is a rich one. There is a strong harmony between them and the ceremonial life you see on view at the Sing Sings. I was friendly with Mac Ruff, a gentle older man, a landscape architect from the southern states of the United States. He and his wife Ruth, based at Unitec in Lae, would venture forth and make their village studies in remote locations around the country, and these are a couple of his beautiful drawings. It just seemed evident to me that Corbusier's 5 points of modern architecture didn't have a great message to communicate in this country climatically or culturally. I had my own practice in Papua New Guinea from 78 to 82, based in Lae, and one of my early jobs was for the Round Round Theatre Group. The name Round Round simply means that the group used to travel round from village to village, initially with little morality plays, and they had themes like the evils of drinking or smoking. But Round Round became very popular. Their productions became more ambitious. They applied to the government for some money to establish a base for their operations in Goroka in the Eastern Highlands. Village houses were round houses in this part of the country, so we used that form taken to a bigger scale as the basis of a formal language to make a theatre for them. The section through the theatre and under construction. It was built by a lifelong friend of mine, Lon Murphy, with a group of Marawaka village people who had no formal training at all, and they had no cranes or anything. They just did it over a couple of year period. There's the thatch going on, and the thatch painted on the underside with a black intumescent paint to somewhat resemble the smoky interiors of the village roundhouses. Goroka is a great coffee growing area, and the Coffee Industry Board wanted to build their headquarters there, a sort of embassy for international coffee sales. The board was made up of Papua New Guineans, half of whom felt that an important building by definition was made of steel and glass and neon lights. And here I had designed one that was all out of materials from Papua New Guinea, maybe not within a 5 mile radius, but as best I could do. So there was a bit of dispute at board level, and I should have quoted them with their own pigeon wisdom. I should have said, "Me work 'em good, Pella. Ina waribalong you fella, I waribalong me tasol, which means that I can do it well out of these materials. You don't have to worry about it. It's my worry. I thought I'd lose the job, but in the long run they stuck with me. I established a kind of order for the job with red circular columns. That was an early decision because in Papua New Guinea they chew betel nut a lot, and if you put lime in your mouth with the betel nut, your mouth goes bright red, and so is all the spit that comes out. So that everywhere in public is despoiled, if you like, or coloured with the red betel nut spit. And I thought, well, the columns may as well, in a public building, may as well be red before we start. So, so here it is. Red circular columns supporting rectangular triple flitched beams. The load and the geometry was transferred through cast iron capital brackets made in the foundry and lay. And here's the ensemble in production, in construction. I say order because it reminded me of the Greek architecture, especially their devising of the Doric order, and it seemed appropriate to have this in mind because I remember Bannister Fletcher, the author of that historical tome, A History of Architecture, describing that order as carpentry and marble. So there's the Doric order, and that's a little illustration I found of its roots, so that the marble architecture was actually based on what the timber architecture looked like in the first place. So it's a weird conjunction that everyone accepts as the classical language now. So there's the building when it was finally built. It looked west, so it had to have a lot of sun control. Looked west over the airstrip, which is a classic PNG situation. The reason there are 600 languages in Papua New Guinea or thereabouts is that they all live in an incredibly mountainous environment, and it might take you 3 or 4 days to get to the next village, even though it's only 500 metres away. So the plane is an incredibly important way of getting around. There was a long-term coffee warehouse. It was always in the wings as a possible commission, and that's why the office came up to a rectangular party wall, and I assumed I'd get the long-term coffee warehouse, and I did. When I first went up to PNG with my young family, my daughter sitting here in the in front, the big job I had evaporated. Not unusual for a private practice. With no work and in debt, I had to kickstart the thing somehow or other. So I went to the city council and told them their public toilets were disgusting and gave them a new design. And to my surprise, they built a couple pretty roughly. The roof was flat galvanised steel draped and folded over the rafters. There are interesting older house types in Leh. This was the site for my big hotel job that didn't go ahead. It was called the Leh Lodge, and there were some beautiful old houses called Bulolo houses. This is the close-up of one of them up in Bulolo, and they're very close to the earlier Queensland houses that the timber companies made and marketed. This is from Campbell's Ready Cut catalogue, so that's the miles. And Bulolo was a timber town after it was a gold dredging town. Gold dredging through the 30s, then became a timber town after the war. And so it developed its own house type. I got involved in devising some housing types of my own. This is staff housing for the supermarket King in Leh, some speculative duplexes for the same client, managers' houses for an old colonial company, and townhouses for the Lutheran Church. However, the predominant house types in the country were the government standard models. This is the so-called L40, grim indeed, That means low covenant 40 square metres in area. Right up to the Deluxe H90 for the expat family, 90 square metres and 3 bedrooms. So these were the buildings we had to compete against. They all had louvers, of course, and in Lae the roads were degenerating because of a brawl between the provincial government and the federal government. And so there was potholes everywhere, dust everywhere. The dust would gather on the louvers. The mould, because of the extraordinary rainfall, the mould would grow on the fly wire, and if you could see out a window, oh, and there were security bars too in between the opening louvers, so that if you could see out a window, it was almost a miracle. So I devised alternatives in area to those buildings. This is an alternative to the L40, and this was an alternative to the H90, and I got to build this one and live in it myself for a while. This was built on Malahang Plantation, and because I dropped it closer to the ground than the H90 government issue, I'll tell you a little bit more about the skin. We had a working principle on the halls of residence. The rain didn't blow much more than 45 degrees. So with a generous roof overhang, I could put slats on the outside of the building with fly wire inside, and the air could come through the walls, and the windows could be fixed glass, so you could look out through the fixed glass without any impediment. And that was the finished building. And because it was lower down to the ground, I had to provide a carport, and that was the little carport that was beside. While we were up in PNG, I got the house in Taringa stained, painted, and when I came back, I added to it. Also, while I was in Papua New Guinea, I entered the Australian Parliament House competition. Whoop. Yeah, Public Works. The Australian Parliament House competition was going. You've got it on your $5 note now, Aldo Jurgler's number. But about 300 firms around the world were competing, I think. They gave money to the first 10, so we came 11th or further back. But you were all acutely aware all the time that you were competing against incredible odds. It was a Herculean task for two of us at the time. Dennis Formiati was then a UQ student on his year out, which in 1979 he spent in my office. He made the model and I did the drawings. And he made a beautiful model, Dennis. Sort of always looks like an aircraft carrier coming into port, just pulling into Capitol Hill. It stood me in good stead later in the 80s when I entered the Darwin Parliament House competition. That was like designing a doll's house by comparison. Also, by that time, I was much more in control about how I wanted to make the building. I wanted to develop the precast concrete planking system devised by Queensland Rail in some of their early stations. I wanted the planks to contain earth colours, then stacked in horizontal layers like strata, dark planks low coming up to light. But the second prize, sadly, didn't give us an opportunity. First prize didn't even go ahead. A bunch of cowboys up there, they got a developer's pet architect down in Melbourne to do it, and that's the one that's up there now. I was back in Australia, and I'd had the Papua New Guinean work that I'd done up there published, and suddenly I was back in the old role I filled when I was doing the halls of residence as the overseas consultant. I was asked by Comworks, as the federal government architects were then known, to comment on and make proposals for 4 British designed buildings on the campus of the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. Basically, the buildings all had orientation issues that I couldn't change, but had to address, and they leaked, they were badly ventilated, they were mouldy. In other words, they weren't coping with tropical life. They accepted my proposed changes on all the buildings. That's one of them, that's the School of Education. But they could only implement them with tied aid from the British, who of course insisted on using British consultants again. So that was a job that went through to the keeper. In those years I did a post office in Nerang, which is used for other purposes now. Sitting beside a little house, having a talk. Some small houses from that era. But more perversely, perhaps, I was engaged for quite a few Canberra jobs through the National Capital Development Commission, and later one for the University of Canberra. This is a big shift in region for me, a very different climate indeed, and what seemed to me a much more formal context. These are some older buildings in Canberra that I quite admired, the hotel there and the little croquet club. It started with townhouses and flats in Canberra, some single occupancy units in Lyneham North, the community centre in Tuggeranong. Quite popular, have your weddings at the hall there. No prizes for guessing where the photographs of the bride and groom take place. And a college, a residential college for the University of Canberra in Belconnen. And at last, well, that's the International House, individual colleges. At last, a small public commission in Spring Hill, Hill House, a group of strata title offices and townhouses. And around about the same time, I'd long been appalled with by a dumb and ubiquitous Brisbane building type called the six-pack. 6 cars on the ground, 3 units above that, 3 above that. I devised an alternative building type going across the site. And after what seemed like 1,000 meetings with the council officers, they on full pay, 2 of my friends influenced my decision. Don Watson revealed to us in his book with his wife Judith Mackay, called Queensland Architects of the 19th Century, the early single skin work of R.G. Souter. And Russell Hall had already worked on this technique in earlier buildings of his own. My work differed in that it used external quality ply and corrugated iron cladding. The studio studs clad on the outside high up on girts and on the inside lower down, eliminating the bottom plate. The house came later with ply, oh well, you can see the studio system there. And that's the finished building with the bridge in front of it. The house came later with ply cladding inside low and outside higher up instead of the iron, with generous roof overhangs over all that, an entrenched habit from Papua New Guinea. Detail of the system. Even the windows I used lapped in the same way, so that the water had a continuous surface to keep on falling off. It had these adjustable screens on the inside under a roof light and vent, so that the fishing sinkers you could push up, and the palm pattern on the screen would slide down between the rafters on cupboard slides. So my experiment with single skin was fairly exhausting. I'll have to admit, on my house for doing 1:10 detail through every stud in the house at 3 levels, so it wasn't one that I wanted to repeat really. However, it did establish a palette of materials I was comfortable with and reused in various combinations in a number of subsequent jobs of more conventional construction. The house and studio you can see on the left there, studio at the back of the site, and the house, the L shape, and we had a driveway coming down beside the block next door, which left another building site on which I built a speculative house. The block I developed with the spec house curved across the site. You can see the crescent shape there, I hope. So it has turned its back to us, to both theirs and our benefit, and had a garden to the northeast, which is a very pleasant aspect. There it is, curving across the site with its orientation towards the inside of the crescent. That's it, looking up to the garden, and bedroom up top and the living spaces underneath. At a much larger scale, I did a house for my brother and sister-in-law. My sister-in-law in the audience. And I said, oh, it's not really a very good idea to do a house for your family. Terrible things could happen. And they had 2 teenage boys living at home at the time. And they went away and had a talk about it and came back, and the vote was 4-0 that I had to go ahead. And we're still talking, so we've survived the blast. It's crescent shape too to the northeast on an acreage in Brookfield. You get the idea. At the other end of the scale, I had a really restricted site in Balmain for the architectural photographer Patrick Bingham Hall and his family. It's a little timber cottage in Balmain, and basically we exploded out the back of it and went up and down to achieve that tragic ultimatum in Sydney, a harbour view. Anyway, that's the lower and middle stories there, and the kids used to slide into that was the dining room in the foreground, and they used to slide in on their backsides and land on the little seat at the table there. He had 5 kids. There was a lot of sliding going, a lot of floor polishing. Around 2000, I was asked to look at a site in Cooktown, a town about as far north of Brisbane as Launceston is south. Cook pulled his ship, the Endeavour, up on shore there in 1770. He had to make repairs after a collision with the reef. A township started there in the late 19th century and serviced the Palmer River goldfields, and a convent was built on the hill. The gallery I added was to tell the story of Cook's time on shore, and Cook's time on shore, on the shore of the Endeavour River, was longer than he spent anywhere else in Australia. The gallery out the back of the traditional convent building, to keep the view from the back veranda up to Grassy Hill, where Cook and his mates used to look out to sea and wonder how the hell they were ever going to get out there again. There's just so much reef on show that it was a combination of skill and luck that got them out, I'm sure. There it is, tucked in behind the veranda of the old convent. An interior, the display about the endeavour and the time on the land. And that's an anchor they retrieved from the reef that Cook had jettisoned at the time after he'd hit the reef to lighten the ship. So the section. In 2007 we decided to move again to a smaller house with a bigger sky. So we bought this little cottage number 113 in the Brisbane Waterworks village at Mount Crosby, 28 kilometres from the city. Built in 1938, it was at the end of an era in which houses in different parts of Australia were actually different. A section through the outer wall shows its method of construction, a method widespread in Queensland before the war, and very like the one in the background of my baby photo that you saw earlier. This house, however, is the house I grew up in as a boy in Taringa. It was built in the 50s during the great homogenisation of the house type in Australia. Its section looked like this, and this section comes from a little booklet put out at the time by the bank. They were the lending authority. I was asked by the Centre for Subtropical Design to make some housing proposals for a range of new age value-added timber products. With the section of the old Commonwealth Bank booklet as a model, I thought if one section can make so much difference to Australia, why not another? I produced this new section and, adopting it as a generator, produced a number of designs for dwellings of different densities and with differing site sizes and orientations. However, without a real commission for a large number, without marketing and finance behind you, it's all a game really, you can't seem to affect the one solution housing juggernaut. Here it comes towards Mount Crosby. Clear felling. I don't know, the developers get away with clear felling, the country boys don't. Not enough restriction there. So Mount Crosby, to finish this talk. Here's the raison d'etre for Mount Crosby, the pumping station. Brisbane, a little potted history of Brisbane's water supply. They got it from the river, then they got it from an Ogre reservoir. They outgrew that. They built Gold Creek Reservoir. They outgrew that. And they looked for a bend in the river with a hill near it so that they could pump water up to the top of the hill and feed it down to the town. That's Mount Crosby. Pumping station is just down the road. It was built in 1890. It's just 100 metres from my place. That's what it looked like then. This is what it looks like now. It still pumps water to Brisbane. It pumps it from the top of the adjacent mountain, well, it's a hill really, and from there, after treatment, it runs downhill into town. Around it, because it was considered a remote location in 1890, they built cottages for the workers. So here's these are duplexes built, and they're being refurbished at the moment, but they were part of the 1890 batch, and quite an unusual building type in Queensland. And they were built for what were called the firemen, the people who shovelled the coal into the fire to make the steam to push the pumps. They probably all died of emphysema at 40 or something. And these are ones from the 1920s. There's the 1940s batch too, when they changed over from steam power to electricity. And the 1940s houses was the electricians. The shop incorporating a post office was built around 1920. I established this date with the president of our local historical society, Col Hester. I always like places that identify themselves as you drive through, and I always had an ambition to do some public sign writing. So, combining these two desires, I spoke to the local shop owners and they let me do just that. So now people who drive by can tell where they are and approximately what date it was built, and the little gizmo on top, a little 3-part thing, is my cartoon of the overflow standpipe built on the top of the mountain in the 1890s. We bought this little 1938 cottage, which is not part of a batch but one off, with its own garage. It looks like this now. But it was tiny, and we built a wing further back from the street, not all that visible from the street. And there's the new wing and the old on the left, and a courtyard to the northeast, and a comfortable big room. Prince Charles once described, reasonably I think, architects' additions as often following the carbuncle theory. That is, the new bit must strive to stand out from the old bit at all costs. I prefer to think of these exercises as being more like meeting up with my grandfather. In the end, we're singing the same tune, sort of harmonising along, albeit in sometimes different materials. It's just a walk around the house, little bits and pieces. I've done a lot of the building myself, and one of the Bond University things they said was what knowledge is dying out, and I can tell you, I built that roof myself and dressed the flashing down into the corrugations, and you can't get anyone to do that south of the border. That's a Queensland practice. I guess the rain just blows more severely here, and whenever I look at a roof built further south, it looks wrong. I love the little frills that bury down into the corrugations, the gable rolls that trim the iron. Okay. I'm a bit too early into the chooks, I think. We'll go back here. Architects of necessity keep scratching around with individual houses, either for themselves or their clients. But I wish I could have had a commission during my working life that had involved a significant number of house types, like Mount Crosby. And I guess I did in Canberra, but I'm just greedy for a few more to make a more meaningful contribution. I think individual houses are pleasant to do, don't get me wrong, and an important testing ground of your ideas. But seeing the architect's role as making individual houses only as bespoke items seems to me just an exercise in painting society's toenails. It's a niche that architects find themselves in, and I don't know what the solution is. It sells popular magazines, TV shows even, with our profession being seen by the public, it seems to me, in a trivial kind of way, as being the sort of provider of eye-catching special effects. That's the end of that gripe. The last set of building users, not known for their views one way or the other, are my chooks. I built them a chook house, largely out of leftovers and offcuts, and then a little mobile wing on the right with wheels. This is their daily production. We used to let them free range, but they dig up every addition to the garden as fast as they're planted. So I fenced a yard down the slope for the chooks to get to, via a stair and a race. Here's Betty taking her first tentative steps on the stair. And here's the whole ensemble. The house, the chook house, the stair, the race and the yard. It's a fairly complex little settlement we have up at Mount Crosby now. I must be running out of projects soon. I think I've certainly run out of time here tonight, so thank you.
Thanks, Rex. Everyone's smiling a lot, and I think everyone kind of is probably feeling pretty happy right now. That was great, and thank you for delivering on the promise. Questions? I think we should have a bit of time for questions. Did you want to answer questions, or do you just want to bail?
Maybe over.
We have a gift for you, Rex.
Oh.
It's an honorary windsock. For those of you that don't know, we installed it for a project. We installed 80 of these last week in a field in Gympie as a way of real-time recording the wind speed across the hill. They're a paint roller stuck in a bit of tube with a bit of strapping welded on. And the cotton comes from St George, and it was part of a whole... Just going to inspect it now.
Well, I tell you why I'm inspecting it. It looks suspiciously like a device that a man who came to my house to remove a carpet python and it should work a treat.
There you go, it's for your chickens actually, that one. That's a temporary housing. We rented our poles, so you'll need to devise your own pole. Or we thought we could come over one time and maybe check out your pad, and maybe find somewhere to put it ourselves.
Okay.
It's really easy when you ask yourself over in front of 80 people. And no one has any questions. Are you all bashful? I've got lots of questions, but mostly they're very hard, like, what should we do now, Rex? Or we're all stuffed, what's the answer? But maybe let's not do that. Let's all talk to Rex after. Thank you all for coming.
Cheers, lad. Yeah. I know, she's bloody quiet.